What happens when a late-night host, known for his unpredictable interviews, sits down with one of the most talked-about figures in modern media? What starts as a casual conversation quickly spirals into one of the most intense exchanges ever captured on television. The tension builds with every question, every answer, until finally something snaps. This is the story of how a simple talk show appearance turned into a full-blown confrontation that nobody saw coming. If you want to see how this unfolds, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about celebrity interviews. Going off the rails, now let's get into what actually happened. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation. Craig Ferguson had built his reputation on being different from other late-night hosts. He didn't do pre-interviews, he didn't stick to scripted questions, and he certainly didn't play it safe. His show was known for going places other hosts wouldn't dare venture. When Meghan Markle was announced as a guest, everyone expected something interesting, but nobody could have predicted just how explosive things would become. The lights dimmed, the band played, and Craig walked out to his usual applause. He had that mischievous glint in his eye, the one that regular viewers knew meant he was in one of those moods. He did his monologue, made a few jokes about current events, and then it was time. The guest segment was about to begin. "My next guest needs no introduction," Craig said, leaning against his desk with that casual confidence he was known for. "She's been on television, she's been in the headlines, and she's been the subject of more think pieces than anyone I can remember. Please welcome Meghan Markle." The audience erupted in applause as Meghan walked onto the stage. She was poised, elegant, wearing a stunning navy blue dress that caught the studio lights perfectly. She waved to the audience, smiled that famous smile, and took her seat across from Craig. The energy between them was immediately palpable, but not in the warm, friendly way you might expect. "Welcome to the show," Craig said, settling into his chair. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me," Meghan replied, her voice steady but with an edge that suggested she was already on guard. "So," Craig began, skipping past any warm-up pleasantries, "I've been watching all this coverage of you for years now, and I have to ask, do you ever get tired of being analyzed?" Meghan's smile tightened slightly. "I think everyone gets tired of being misrepresented, Craig. There's a difference between being analyzed and being deliberately misunderstood." "Deliberately." Craig raised an eyebrow. "That's a strong word. You think people are deliberately trying to misunderstand you?" "I think some people have made up their minds about who I am without ever having a real conversation with me," Meghan said, her tone measured but firm. "I think narratives get created, and then those narratives become the truth, whether they're accurate or not." Craig leaned back in his chair, studying her. "But you've done interviews before, right? You've had platforms to tell your story. Are you saying those platforms didn't work? Or that people just weren't listening?" The audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't the usual softballs that guests got on talk shows. This was Craig doing what he did best, pushing boundaries and asking questions that made people uncomfortable. "I'm saying that sometimes it doesn't matter what you say," Meghan responded, her voice taking on a sharper tone. "Sometimes people hear what they want to hear. They take a sentence out of context, they create a headline that fits their agenda, and suddenly you're explaining something you never actually said." "Right, but you're a public figure," Craig countered. "Isn't that part of the deal? You get the platform, the visibility, the opportunities, and in exchange, people get to have opinions about you. Some of those opinions won't be flattering. Having opinions is fine," Meghan said, and now there was steel in her voice. "But there's a difference between having an opinion and conducting a campaign of harassment. There's a difference between criticism and cruelty." Craig nodded slowly. "Okay, I hear that. But here's what I'm curious about. When does legitimate criticism cross into this campaign you're talking about? Because I've seen some of the criticism directed at you, and yeah, some of it is definitely over the line. But some of it seems like people just disagreeing with choices you've made. How do you distinguish between the two?" Meghan's jaw tightened. "I think when you've lived through it, Craig, you know the difference. When you've had people fabricate stories about you, when you've had your character assassinated on a daily basis, when you've had your mental health pushed to the breaking point, you understand that it's not just about disagreement, but you knew what you were getting into, didn't you?" Craig pressed. "I mean, you're not naive. You understood that marrying into that particular family would come with scrutiny." The audience went completely silent. This was the moment where most hosts would have backed off, would have moved to a lighter topic. But Craig Ferguson wasn't most hosts. Meghan's eyes flashed. Knowing something intellectually and experiencing it in reality are two completely different things. And I think it's interesting that whenever someone talks about the treatment they've received, there's always someone ready to say, well, you should have known better. As if that justifies anything. I'm not trying to justify anything, Craig said, his tone remaining conversational but pointed. I'm trying to understand the logic. You chose a very public life. You made that choice, and now you're upset that the public has opinions about that choice. Help me understand why that's unfair. Because having opinions doesn't give anyone the right to be cruel, Meghan shot back. Because being a public figure doesn't mean you forfeit your humanity. Because choosing to be in the spotlight doesn't mean you consent to abuse. Abuse is a strong word, Craig said. It's the appropriate word, Meghan replied immediately. What would you call it when people write articles speculating about your mental state, your marriage, your relationships with your family? All based on nothing but anonymous sources and fabricated quotes. What would you call it when people feel entitled to comment on everything from how you hold your baby to what you wear to a private event? Craig paused, considering. I'd probably call it annoying. Invasive? Maybe. But abuse? I don't know if I'd go that far. Then you've never experienced it at this level, Meghan said, and her voice was cold now. You've never had thousands of people you've never met decide that they hate you based on stories that aren't true. You've never had to explain to your children why strangers are saying terrible things about their mother. You're right, I haven't, Craig admitted. But I also didn't marry into one of the most famous families in the world and then seem surprised when people had a lot to say about it. I didn't do multiple high-profile interviews talking about how difficult everything was and then get frustrated when people questioned the narrative. The tension in the studio was now impossible to ignore. Meghan's publicist, sitting in the wings, looked like she wanted to intervene. But Meghan raised a hand slightly, signaling that she was handling it. You think I'm being inconsistent, Meghan said, her voice quiet but intense. You think I want privacy, but also want a platform. You think I want to be left alone, but also want to tell my story. Let me be very clear, Craig. I want to be treated like a human being. I want the truth to matter more than the narrative. And I want people to understand that you can ask for compassion without being accused of playing the victim. But are you playing the victim? Craig asked, and the question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Meghan stared at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone in that studio heard every word. If standing up for yourself means you're playing the victim in some people's eyes, then I guess I'm guilty. If refusing to accept lies and manipulation means I'm not being gracious enough, then I'll accept that criticism. But I will not sit here and pretend that what I've experienced is normal or acceptable or something I should have just quietly endured. Craig leaned forward. Nobody's asking you to quietly endure anything. But when you tell your story, other people get to respond. That's how it works. You can't control the conversation once you start it. I'm not trying to control anything, Meghan said, her frustration now evident. I'm trying to correct the record. There's a difference between controlling a narrative and simply asking that the truth be told. And you're the arbiter of what the truth is, Craig asked. I'm the arbiter of my own experience, Meghan fired back. Nobody else gets to tell me how I felt or what I went through. Nobody else gets to rewrite my story to fit their preferred version of events. The commercial break signal flashed, but neither of them seemed to notice. The producer was probably having a heart attack, but the audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't going according to anyone's plan, and that made it absolutely riveting television. Craig sat back, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. We need to take a break, but we're going to continue this conversation. Don't go anywhere. As the cameras cut away, the studio remained in absolute silence. Meghan sat perfectly still, her composure intact, but her eyes blazing. Craig looked almost pleased with himself, as if he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. This interview was far from over, and things were about to get even more intense. The commercial break lasted exactly 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Craig took a sip of water from the mug on his desk, never breaking eye contact with Meghan. She didn't touch the glass that had been placed beside her chair. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they should be excited or concerned about what they were witnessing. When the stage manager counted them back in, the atmosphere in the studio was electric. "Welcome back," Craig said as the cameras rolled again. We're here with Meghan Markle, and we were having quite a conversation before the break. I want to continue because I think there's something important here that we're circling around. By all means, Meghan said, her voice cool and controlled. Continue. You talked about truth and having your experience validated, Craig said, leaning forward with his elbows on his desk. But here's what I'm struggling with. You've done interviews where you've made very specific claims about very specific people. Those people can't really respond because of their positions, their protocols. Doesn't that feel a bit one-sided to you? Meghan's expression hardened. Are you suggesting I shouldn't have spoken up because other people couldn't respond the way they might want to? I'm suggesting that there's a power dynamic there that maybe doesn't get acknowledged enough, Craig replied. You get to sit down with major media figures and tell your side of the story to millions of people. The other parties involved are constrained by tradition, by duty, by rules that you're no longer bound by. That's a pretty significant advantage in shaping public opinion. An advantage? Meghan repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. You think it's an advantage to have to defend yourself on international television because the institution you were part of hung you out to dry. You think it's an advantage to have to correct lies because the people who could have corrected them chose not to. I think it's an advantage to have a platform when others don't, Craig said simply. I think it's an advantage to be able to control your narrative while others are silent. Whether you had good reasons for doing it is a separate question from whether it gave you a strategic advantage. Strategic, Meghan said, and she laughed, but there was no humor in it. You make it sound like this was some calculated move, like I sat down and thought about how I could strategically damage people who couldn't fight back. That's not what happened, Craig. That's not even close to what happened. Then what did happen? Craig asked. Help me understand. Walk me through the decision-making process. At what point did you decide that going public was the right move? Meghan was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was measured but intense. I decided to go public when I realized that staying silent was killing me. When I realized that protecting an institution that wasn't protecting me was costing me my mental health, my sense of self, everything that made me who I am. You want to know about decision-making? The decision was between speaking up and completely losing myself. But you had other options, Craig pushed. You could have left quietly. You could have stepped back without doing interviews, without making public statements. Other people have done that. Other people aren't me, Meghan snapped. Other people didn't have lies told about them in the press on a daily basis. Other people didn't have their reputation systematically destroyed while the people, who could have stopped it, chose to do nothing. You keep talking about advantages and strategic moves, but you're not talking about what it actually feels like to watch yourself be turned into a villain in real time while nobody who knows the truth says a word. Craig nodded slowly. Okay, I hear that. But when you did speak out, you made some pretty serious allegations. Allegations about racism, about lack of support during mental health crises. Those aren't small claims. Did you have proof? Did you have evidence beyond your personal feelings about what happened? The audience gasped. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Meghan's publicist looked like she was about to have a stroke, but Meghan herself went very still. Are you asking me to prove that I experienced racism? Meghan asked, her voice dangerously quiet. I'm asking you how we distinguish between your interpretation of events and what actually happened, Craig said, because interpretation matters. If someone makes a comment that you interpret as racist, but they don't intend it that way, who's right? Your interpretation or their intention? Impact matters more than intention, Meghan said immediately. If someone says something that causes harm, claiming they didn't mean it that way doesn't erase the harm. And Craig, I have to say, the fact that you're asking me to prove racism, to provide evidence from my own lived experience, that in itself is part of the problem. But we can't just accept everything at face value, Craig countered. If we're going to have serious conversations about serious issues, we need to be able to examine claims, to ask questions, to understand context. Otherwise, what are we doing? Just accepting whatever anyone says because questioning it might be uncomfortable. There's a difference between asking questions and demanding that someone prove their trauma met your standards of evidence, Meghan said, her voice rising slightly. There's a difference between seeking understanding and putting someone on trial for their own experiences. Is that what you think I'm doing? Craig asked. Putting you on trial? I think you're doing exactly what everyone else does, Meghan said. You're questioning my credibility, my motives, my interpretation of my own life. You're treating me like I'm some unreliable narrator who needs to be fact-checked and cross-examined instead of a person who lived through something difficult and tried to survive it. Craig spread his hands. But isn't that what discourse is? Isn't that what happens when you make public statements about controversial topics? People examine them, they question them, they push back. That's not persecution, that's conversation. No, Craig, that's not what this is, Meghan said, and now her composure was starting to crack. Conversation would be if you asked me what happened and actually listened to the answer. Conversation would be if you approached this with some basic level of empathy, instead of treating it like a debate exercise. What you're doing is interrogating me, and I'm done being interrogated. I'm not interrogating you, Craig said, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. I'm asking the questions that a lot of people have. I'm giving voice to the skepticism that exists out there. Isn't it better to address it head-on rather than pretend it doesn't exist? Address it how? Meghan demanded. By justifying myself to you, by proving that I'm worthy of compassion, by meeting some arbitrary standard of victimhood that you've decided is acceptable. I don't owe you or anyone else proof that my pain was real enough. But you asked for public support, Craig said. You can't ask for support and then get angry when people want to understand the full picture. The full picture, Meghan repeated. What you mean is you want to hear from the other side. You want to hear from people who can't speak publicly so that you can decide who's telling the truth. But here's what you're not getting, Craig. This isn't a he said, she said situation. This is me telling you what I experienced and you deciding whether I'm believable enough for you to care. The studio had gone completely silent again. Even the crew members who had seen hundreds of interviews were transfixed by what was unfolding. This had gone beyond contentious, beyond awkward. This was to people locked in a battle of perspectives with no middle ground in sight. You're putting words in my mouth, Craig said. I never said, I don't believe you. I never said, I don't care. What I'm saying is that these are complex situations with multiple perspectives, and reducing them to simple narratives doesn't serve anyone. Complex situations, Meghan said, her voice shaking now with barely controlled anger. Is that what you call it when someone tells you they were suicidal and got no help? Is that what you call it when someone tells you they experienced racism and you ask them to prove it? Complexity is your way of avoiding having to take a position, of avoiding having to say that what happened was wrong. I don't know all the details of what happened, Craig said. Nobody does, except the people who were there. Exactly, Meghan said. Nobody knows except the people who were there. I was there, Craig. I was there for all of it. Every conversation, every slight, every moment of being made to feel like I didn't matter. And you're sitting here telling me that my account of my own life isn't enough? What would be enough? What do I need to provide for you to accept that my experience was real? Craig paused, and for the first time, he seemed slightly unsure of himself. I'm not saying your experience wasn't real. I'm saying that experiences are subjective, and that doesn't mean they're the complete truth of a situation. Then what is the complete truth? Meghan asked. Whose version gets to be the definitive one? The institution's, the one they're not telling because they never comment on these things. Or mine, the one I'm being questioned about at every turn. You talk about complexity and multiple perspectives, but what you're really doing is giving cover to people who hurt me by suggesting that maybe I'm the one who got it wrong. That's not what I'm doing, Craig insisted. That's exactly what you're doing, Meghan said. And the worst part is, you think you're being reasonable. You think you're being balanced. But what you're actually doing is perpetuating the exact same dynamics that made things so unbearable in the first place. You're making me justify my pain, explain my trauma, prove my worthiness of basic human empathy. And for what? So your audience can decide if I deserve their sympathy. Craig sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I think we're coming at this from fundamentally different places. No kidding, Meghan said bitterly. You want validation without scrutiny, Craig continued. You want people to accept your account without question because questioning it feels like an attack. But that's not how public discourse works. That's not how we arrive at truth or understanding or any kind of shared reality. Meghan stood up suddenly, and for a moment, everyone thought she was going to walk off the set. But she didn't. She stood there, looking down at Craig with an expression that was equal parts fury and exhaustion. You want to know what the problem is, Craig? Meghan said, her voice cutting through the silence. The problem is that you think this is an intellectual exercise. You think you're being some kind of fearless journalist by asking tough questions. But what you're really doing is re-traumatizing someone on national television and calling it discourse. Craig remained seated, looking up at her. If my questions are uncomfortable, maybe that says something about the answers. Your questions aren't uncomfortable. They're insulting, Meghan said. Every single one of them has been designed to undermine me, to make me seem unreliable, to suggest that maybe I'm exaggerating or misremembering or just plain lying. And you've done it all with this veneer of objectivity, as if you're just an innocent seeker of truth rather than someone with an agenda. What agenda would that be? Craig asked. The same agenda everyone seems to have, Meghan replied. To tear me down. To prove that I'm the problem. To confirm whatever preconceptions your audience already has about me. You didn't bring me here to have a conversation, Craig. You brought me here to have a confrontation. And congratulations, you got one. I brought you here to talk, Craig said, his voice level. You're the one who's turning this into something it doesn't need to be. I'm turning this into something. Meghan's voice rose. You've spent the last 20 minutes questioning my credibility, demanding proof of my trauma, suggesting that speaking up about abuse was somehow a strategic power play, and I'm the one making this difficult. You came on this show knowing my style, Craig said. I don't do puff pieces. I don't throw softball questions. If that's what you were looking for, you came to the wrong place. I came here thinking I'd be treated with basic respect, Meghan said. I came here thinking that, maybe, just maybe, someone would actually listen instead of cross-examining me like I'm a hostile witness. But I was wrong. I should have known better. The audience was completely riveted. Some people looked uncomfortable, others fascinated, but nobody could look away. This had become something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of the typical talk show format. So what do you want from me? Craig asked, spreading his hands. An apology? Agreement. What would make this okay for you? I want you to understand that your questions have consequences, Meghan said, her voice trembling with emotion now. I want you to understand that when you treat someone's pain like it's up for debate, when you question whether their experiences are valid, you're doing real harm. But I don't think you do understand that. I don't think you care. Of course I care, Craig said, but his tone was defensive now. But caring doesn't mean accepting everything without question. It means approaching it with humanity, Meghan shot back. It means recognizing that not everything is a debate. Some things are just true because the person who lived them says they're true. My experience doesn't need your validation, Craig. It doesn't need your approval. It just is. Craig stood up now, facing her across the desk. And my questions are just questions. They don't have to be attacks just because they make you uncomfortable. They're not making me uncomfortable. They're revealing who you are, Meghan said coldly. They're showing everyone watching exactly what I've been talking about. This is what it looks like. This constant questioning, this constant demand that I prove myself, this complete lack of empathy or understanding. You've just demonstrated everything I've been trying to explain. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The studio was so quiet, you could hear the cameras humming. Finally, Meghan grabbed her phone from beside her chair. I think we're done here. We still have 10 minutes left in the segment, Craig said. No, we don't, Meghan replied, because I'm leaving. Thank you for proving my point so thoroughly. She started to walk toward the stage exit, her heels clicking on the floor, each step echoing in the silent studio. Craig called after her. Running away doesn't make you right, you know. Meghan stopped, turned around, and walked back toward the desk. For a moment, it looked like she might say something cutting, something final. Instead, she just looked at him with something like pity. I'm not running away, Craig. I'm choosing not to participate in my own dehumanization. There's a difference. And someday, maybe you'll understand that. She turned and walked off the set. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or sit in stunned silence. Most chose silence. Craig stood there for a moment, then looked at the camera. Well, he said, his trademark humor completely absent. That happened. We're going to take a break. As the show cut to commercial, the footage of what had just transpired was already starting to spread online. Within hours, it would be everywhere. The interview that was supposed to be just another late-night appearance had become something else entirely. A raw, unfiltered clash that exposed something deeper about public figures, media responsibility, and the cost of constantly having to defend your own reality. The conversation had ended, but the fallout was only beginning. And depending on who you asked, Either Meghan had walked away from a hostile interview with her dignity intact, or Craig had asked the tough questions that needed to be asked. There was no middle ground, no easy answer. Just two people who had fundamentally different views on what accountability, truth, and humanity actually meant. So what do you think? Was Craig out of line with his questions, or was he just doing his job as an interviewer? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you want to see more breakdowns of the most intense celebrity moments, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.